So, and I won't take much of your time because this session has really interesting conversations about online dialogue, about the polarization which we're seeing as part of the characteristic of the way it seems society globally manage pandemics. Everything's been amplified. All the bad things have been amplified, the inequalities, the detachments. We even talk about social exclusion when we actually mean spatial exclusion. So everything's been amplified. But I wanted to focus at this outset and pick up really from the first session as well. And as Francis has said, we're at a really important time to reflect on what challenges, new challenges have emerged and what perhaps new opportunities. So let's not look just at the negatives, but also the positives. But I start really by this notion of let's not get hung up too much in definitions. I know it was a feature of the first session. It shouldn't bother us if we focus on what we're trying to achieve together. What we're trying to achieve together is some platform, some process whereby people can engage, as our first keynote referred, can encounter one another in a relatively peaceful and trust-based space and can exchange and go on to engage. And it's through the engagement that you're going to have the outcomes, such as in the Japanese case study, that we're all seeking. So if we get hung up too much on definitions, we worry about what is and what isn't dialogue, about whether we're listening, whether we're hearing. We don't always make progress. So two things that I start in reflection. Firstly is that we're in a mess. 2020, nobody could have forecast what a state we're going to be in. The Chancellor's description of the economy yesterday probably understates the mess we're in. But we're going to come out of it. And I'm really focused in my work now on trying to define what sort of world we want when we come out of it. Because I, for one, don't want to go back to where we were when we went into this year, because we weren't in a good place. And I think it sharpens our ability to set agendas. So let's use the opportunity of the pandemic. Let's reflect on the trauma, the misery, the sadness, and the loss. But let's also see how we can, as practitioners, as academics, as policymakers, move out of it into a different place and a better place. And the second thing, I reflect on this Huxley quote, which often comes to me, that the fact is matter that everything's different, but actually everything's always the same. So we have to actually intervene to change things. And towards the end of my very short intervention, I'm going to set us a few statements about what we need to change. And then we have to go away and think how we do that. So what are the big changes that actually COVID and the pandemic have brought about? There's many I could talk about, but I've focused here on the reality that all our work and experience has tended to be with field work, with face-to-face engagement, with a dialogue between people in physical space. And what we know with mandatory spatial distances force us to disconnect in ways that we haven't been forced to disconnect often, particularly in our communities and societies. We know that there's going to be huge changes. And the biggest, I think, change that human ingenuity will have to reflect on and develop is this notion of the digital technology and the digital economy in which we're working. And we're doing today's workshop as a good example. So the answer to what's really changed as a result of these spatial distances is obvious. It's digital technology has changed. But even that appears obvious. It needs really careful examination because of the enormous potential it has, both positive and negative. We touched in the last session as well about some of the demagoguery, some of the autocracy that had emerged, fueled by digital technology. And we now know that there's as much bad as there is good from these sorts of changes. So how can we mobilize the potential of digital technology to transform our post-COVID world? And just thinking all the time that it is through the digital technology that we will amplify the dialogue that is at the base of our discussion today. So when it's all over, what sort of world do we want? And how can we influence that in the research we do, in the discussions that we have, and in the facilitation that we offer to communities and to neighborhoods? Well, I think things have to change, the way we do things, how we do things, and where we do things. And it's interesting to reflect on what sort of change. The normal default is to go back and change our structures. And my thesis, I think, my brief interlude this morning is to say that structures will adapt and can be changed. And I'm much more interested in how we change our behaviors and the culture. I would leave the structures to one side. Who would have thought that most of our shopping would be through digital technology? We don't need the high street. That creates huge problems for the high street and for the economy as a result. But it's an illustration of how structures really can adapt and change and will move on. Whereas behaviors and cultures are much more fundamental and much more important to our discussion. So let's be different as we move out of the pandemic and into our new world. Let's question our approach to rules. Let's not take all rules for granted. Let's not break rules unnecessarily, but let's question how rules help create platforms and create opportunities. Let's be imaginative in where we look for strengths. Let's not look at traditional sources of strength and resources. Let's look for creative and innovative. And there's been lots about. Just think of the positives of what has become for many a precarious economy of the Uber world that we live in. Not all of that is difficult and bad. Some of it has enabled processes of engagement which we didn't have before. So we can look for strengths in the way we do things and the way we relate in new and innovative places. Let's remember that at the base of all positive dialogue is empathy. And we need to think how we can be empathetic when we're stuck in our studies at home, in our front rooms at home, talking on a computer. And we need to set the conditions for what I call compassionate collaboration. We must be collaborative. That's the lesson of public health. And I want us to be not just collaborative, but compassionate when we collaborate, to think and to empathize with others. So finally, my set of questions, if you like, I've phrased them here in a sort of a checklist of things we need to change. This is my vision, this wonderful cartoon of the future when we're sitting down sorting out the world that we really don't know and understand. I think if we're going to be effective coming out of this pandemic, if we're going to up our game with dialogue, with the encounter, the exchange, and the engagement that I referred to, we need to change our behavior. And we need to change the culture that drives the dialogue that we engage with. So a set of actions. We've got to find ways in which we're more comfortable with uncertainty. There's a time we're living in now when decision makers and experts are struggling to relate one to another. That's a new, interesting insight into the dialogue that we didn't have before. It's very clear that many decision makers say that they're relying on the science, and many scientists say that the decision makers are just not listening. That's an interesting insight. But actually, we all need to reflect that this is actually an insight about how we deal with uncertainty. So how many dialogue contexts happen in a complete void of certain predictable outcomes? How many are just accidental dialogues? And these are things that we need to be comfortable with. We need to encourage innovation and then experimentation. To do that, we have to have a culture that learns from mistakes, that acknowledges mistakes. We're not very good at that. And I think we could be a lot better. I've talked already about seeking strength from unexpected places. Once we find strengths, we have to mobilize it. That means some humility sometimes when we find that there are sources and resources in our community that are just not expected. Then we have to mobilize them and we have to get behind them. We have to fight the forces of prejudice wherever we see them. This is non-negotiable to me. Where there's prejudice, there is disharmony. And we need to remove the forces of prejudice and promote and commit the forces for pluralism and inclusion, and be unambiguous about it and non-apologetic. We need to make self-correction easier. So we need a whole set of rules for our dialogue that commits to learning and to embedding learning. And finally, we need to inspire, and we need to resist the current tendency, fueled by the digital technology I referred to earlier, for celebrity. Think about that. We haven't got time to debate it at length. I want to inspire people because they're doing the right thing, rather than because they're role modeling against some sort of celebrity existence. We cannot have a world ruled by elites and celebrities. We have to ground this in neighborhoods and communities. So I finish with a Huxley quote as well, that the very interesting lesson of history is that we don't learn very much. We have an opportunity here with getting comfortable with new technologies to learn more about the important things that matter. I was very pleased with Professor Camilleri's start this morning when he raised two important things that I just remind us about. The first is that dialogue without acknowledged and recognized stakeholders is a pretty empty and vacuous thing. So nearly all the case studies that we've talked about and many of the papers that we've yet to have presented do talk essentially about stakeholders and about their importance, and that's critical. But reflecting on the change in context that the digital world will bring, we'll have more access, we'll have greater accessibility, there'll be more stakeholders, and they won't be the usual ones. So we have to retool and re-equip the context for dialogue in this respect. And finally, he talked also about the big picture and how complex it is. And my final comment really is that there is increasing understanding, and in the literature on dialogue, that the world is not a simple linear place. Because of uncertainty, because of unpredictability, we no longer go from A to B. So framing dialogue in a start, middle, and end sort of scenario just doesn't work. We live in a complex, adaptive system. We live in a world in which linearity is no longer relevant for making progress, where we have to go in 5 different directions at the same time in order to make any sense of progress. Now, that sounds a bit down, doom and gloom, but I don't think so. I think we're in a position now where inclusion matters more, and we should therefore promote it more. And we're in a position where digital technology can be mobilized to give voice to places which didn't have it before. Thank you, Francis, for that moment.